Hi, my name is Alex, and in this episode of Magic Miso Minis, I'm going to be sculpting a noble warlock for a commission. So, to start, I take a long piece of wire, about 7 centimeters long, and fold it in half, clamping it down with pliers and twisting it to create the torso and the legs for the armature. In the intro, I referred to this miniature as going to be a noble warlock, but to be honest, I'm not entirely sure how true that is. Simply going off of the art that was sent to me by the client, he seemed to be a noble for sure, and also have some magical abilities, since he has like a large ice sword and glowing eyes. And here you can see the pose that I use, which is basically the same pose he is in the art that I was sent. So with the armature finished, I can start adding my first layer of green stuff. Though I forgot to file down the miniature, so you can kind of see here that the green stuff is a little bit more slidey than it normally would be. And with that set, I can start working on the sculpt itself. This character seems to have a waistcoat with a kind of a long collar and a dress shirt with rolled up sleeves. So here you can see me doing the sleeves of the dress shirt, as well as adding a little bit more material to bulk out his forearms. While that sets, I start working on the legs and the pants that he's wearing that seem to fold in an interesting way around his knees. Again, I'm trying to follow the artwork that was sent to me as closely as possible. And actually having this reference for exactly what the character is supposed to look like is very, very helpful, since I don't have to look up other pieces of reference for sculpting certain parts. I just have all the reference I need. Once that sets, I move on to sculpt some of the other details. One detail that this miniature has is a seemingly piece of cloth underneath his waistcoat, so I start by doing that since it is the farthest from the foreground. Making sure to add a little bit going around the miniature since it's kind of like seems to be tied underneath his waistcoat. I'm not entirely sure what it is, but I'm sculpting what I can see of it. Once I'm happy with where that is, I go ahead and I start sculpting the boots for this character. Starting by bulking out his shins a little bit more, and then adding another little piece that's going to act as the cuff for his boots. And while I let those set, I can start working on the waistcoat, starting by adding a large piece of green stuff to the chest area and sculpting that into the shape I need. Again, this is the kind of thing where it's helpful to have an understanding of anatomy. Even though you're not necessarily seeing muscles, understanding the basic shape that you're going to need for a torso is very, very important for making your miniatures look accurate. Once the torso is in the shape that I need it to be, and while the green stuff is still setting, I take one of my rubber sculpting tools and I sculpt in a little indentation for where the fold of the waistcoat would be. While that sets, I can start working on the ice sword I mentioned that this character has. Getting a wire, putting some milliput over top of it, and then putting it on a unused miniature base. Sculpting that into the general shape of what I'm looking for, which for this weapon is going to be something akin to a saber. But I don't worry about the exact shape because I'm going to work on that with a file later on. And while the milliput sets, I start sculpting the face for this miniature. As I mentioned in a previous video, I'm trying a different style of sculpting faces, and so you can see me working on that here. And I was going to work on some other parts of the miniature, but I noticed that one of the legs wasn't quite matching the other one. The folds that I had added were a little bit too high. So I chop it up with a craft knife and then add more green stuff so that both of the legs are matching and doesn't look like he has one leg longer than the other one. Or technically they're the same size, so one knee higher than the other one, which is kind of more concerning, honestly. I then return to the face now that it's set, and I put in some holes for where the eyes are going to be, and put tiny little round bits of green stuff in those holes. And then I can return to the saber we were working on, taking it with a file as I mentioned earlier, and starting by filing it down for the flat of the blade, and then cut it down to size because I noticed that the blade was going to be very, very wide and wasn't going to match the scale that the rest of the miniature was. And then, once again using the craft knife, I sculpt out the blade, or file out the blade, scrape off the blade, I don't know, I make it sharper, I guess. Anyways, once that's done, I can use the same craft knife to take the sword off of the base I was working on it on, and then sharpen the other side of the blade, just holding it in my hand. I then go back to the miniature itself and start sculpting the back of the waistcoat, giving the jacket a little bit of a tail coming out from the back, as you can see mostly finished here. I then make the collar for the waistcoat, making one side of the collar longer than the other, since that's what I've seen in the art. And then, of course, I add the character's belt, doing my best to avoid any tangents that might appear between the angled waistcoat and the belt itself. This idea of avoiding tangents is often talked about in two-dimensional art, but is equally as important when you're doing sculpting. Because let's say you have the hem of a waistcoat and a belt running along right next to each other, it can make the composition of the character a little bit difficult to differentiate and make it just kind of confusing to look at. So you can see that I specifically make sure that the belt goes over this so that there's no tangents where they're both right next to each other. Again, this isn't as much of a problem for sculpting, but it still is something to look out for. Speaking of tangents, I talked a little bit too long about that, but I thought it was important, and while I was talking about that, you can see that I added a little bit of a sash or piece of cloth that's attached to the belt itself. And then I add a second belt to the character just to make him a little bit more interesting, which is a topic that I actually tackled in another video if you want to go check that out. I believe that the link should be in the card. It looks like I lost the footage where I added the saber to the miniature. Basically, I bent a little bit of a loop into the wire, fed the wire of the weapon through that loop, and added some green stuff for the hand. And then I go ahead and add a little bit more green stuff around the collar for the collar of the shirt itself. And after that, I also add a little bit of green stuff to the weapon itself to create the handle for the weapon, as well as adding a little bit more green stuff for the hand guards. Unfortunately, I also lost some footage from when I sculpted the face, but here you can see me taking the face and attaching it to the miniature itself. And once that sets, I can add a little bit more green stuff to work on the hair, texturing that with a needle to give him some slicked back, kind of sailor-ish hair almost, since he also has a ponytail. That I add just a little bit of green stuff, and once again texturing that with a needle to make it actually look like hair. And as a final detail for the sculpt, I add some ears for the character. And here is a little bit of a turnaround for the final sculpt. Unfortunately, this seemed to be the episode where I kept forgetting to film stuff, because I also didn't film the turnaround with the primer on it. But nonetheless, I start by painting the waistcoat a dark cobalt blue, and I paint the pants a slightly more vibrant and lighter blue, and then adding some of the details with an even lighter blue than that. As you can see, I add a little bit of blue onto the inside of the collar, which adds some variation that kind of makes it stand out a little bit more. Then base coat the sleeves of the shirt in a white, being sure to add several layers of slightly watered down paint to get a nice solid color onto the sleeves. Also making sure not to neglect the collar of the dress shirt. Then get a brown and paint the boots as well as the belts in this same brown, and add a little bit of a dry brush to help add some variation for the leather. Also add some detailing to the cloth that I had mentioned is underneath his waistcoat, adding some border lines that seem to be patterns that I noticed on the art I was sent. Adding a pale yellow line, as well as adding a slightly more burgundy line right next to it. I then move on to add the flesh tone to the arms and the face of the miniature, doing the same thing that I did for the white, adding several layers of the color to make sure that it has a nice even solid color by the end of it. I also add a little bit of white into the black hair that the character has to give him some salt and pepper hair. And then I go ahead and play around with how I want to paint the sword. I knew that the sword was meant to be made out of ice, so I played around with some of the techniques I had used in my video on non-metallic metals to hopefully create a kind of glassy see-through effect. Or at least I was hoping that I might be able to distinguish it from the rest of the miniature and the way that that was painted. If you're interested in watching that video, you can check that out in the link in the card. But the crux of it is just playing around with lots of smooth transitions and very, very bright highlights and dark shadows. So you can see here, I started with one large transition from a deep black to the kind of blue azure that I want the base tone of this to be. And then go to add some white highlights around the edge of it. And then again, keep playing around with this and just kind of winging it and seeing where I can end up. And here you can kind of see where I ended up, and I quite like how it turned out. I really enjoy doing this kind of NMM style of painting, and I'd love to get even better at it, so you might see that in future videos. And of course I make sure to do the same on the other side of the blade as well as the handle. With that done, I can move on to do the highlighting. So I take the same colors I had already mixed up, add a little bit of white to them and a little bit of water, and add those to all of the highlights, hitting them with a dry brush to kind of spread the paint around and create a gradient effect. And for the white on the arms, I specifically add some shadows to it, adding a little bit of a light gray, so that also has a little bit of variation. I then go ahead and add the white into the character's eyes, and then also take a slightly darker flesh tone, which is the same flesh tone I was using before, but with a little bit of brown in it to highlight some of the main shadows. I think you can highlight shadows, but you know what I was trying to say. I also take some black and give the character some eyebrows and add a little bit of glow around the eyes. Like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, that's kind of what tipped me off about the character being a warlock or having some magical ability. I then can add some washes, adding Reichland Flesh Shade, a red wash over all of the flesh tones, as well as adding Agrax Earthshade to the entirety of the miniature to create more shadow and to make the miniature look a little bit dirtier. For a final touch, I add all the metallics, adding a little bit of gold for the buttons on his waistcoat and a little bit of silver onto his belt buckle. One thing I'm probably going to be doing on the channel a little bit more frequently is sculpting and painting these commissions. I recently got quite a few and didn't know how to fit them into my work schedule without making videos for them, so you can expect more of these kinds of projects in the future. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please leave a like, subscribe, and hit the bell to get notified whenever I release a new video. If you have any questions or video suggestions on topics you want me to cover, leave them in the comments. But nonetheless, thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.